Problem going on down here. I just want to make sure you weren't that guys.
All right, so you're just trying to keep an eye on stuff then?
Yeah, excuse me for if I got you excited.
All right.
It stinks bad.
You can pick your friends, and you can pick your nose.
Her boots, blue jeans, and I think it was a dark t-shirt and baseball cap, and he's got a little pug rider that is with him everywhere.
Who is Patrick to
It's
you?
one of my dear kids that I've taken under my wing.
Okay, so not biological.
No.
Okay.
This picture.
Yeah, picture, okay. Does this picture resemble what he looks like right now?
His beard is a little fuller, and his hair is in better shape than that.
You mentioned something about when you talked about him going to Ellen Bruce's. It seemed like you said something to where they had some conflict recently. They have?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know why he went there?
He was supposed to go move his motorhomes, and when he got out there, Alan had moved them with the bulldozer.
Okay.
Not good. Probably screwed up the transmissions, and I don't know.
A man is missing. No witnesses. No crash. No desperate 911 call. No clear explanation. Just an empty stretch of rural Idaho, and a truck that should not have been there. The vehicle sat alone on a remote dirt road west of Chalice, surrounded by miles of rugged wilderness. There were no signs of an accident. No indication that the driver had simply walked away. The engine was silent. The landscape was still. And inside the truck was a detail investigators would never forget. Patrick Shelton's dog. Alive. Waiting. As if expecting its owner to return at any moment. But Patrick Shelton never did. Just hours earlier, the 47-year-old had set out on what should have been a routine trip to gather firewood. It was the kind of task he had done countless times before. Nothing unusual. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that would have caused his family to worry. He left home expecting to come back. His family expected him back too. But as the day faded into evening, something felt wrong. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages weren't returned. The hours stretched longer. Concern slowly turned into fear. And before long, the people who loved Patrick found themselves facing a question they never imagined they would have to ask. Where was he? At first, authorities treated it as a missing person case. After all, people disappear for many reasons. They get lost. They suffer accidents. They lose cell service in remote areas. But as investigators began piecing together Patrick's final movements, the picture became increasingly troubling. The evidence wasn't pointing toward a man who had gotten lost. It was pointing toward something else. Something darker. What began as a search and rescue effort soon transformed into a homicide investigation. A rural property. A confrontation. And a confession so disturbing that it would later make headlines across the country. A confession that raised even more questions than answers. But at the time Patrick vanished, no one knew any of that yet. No one knew where the investigation would lead. No one knew that detectives were about to uncover a story involving violence, concealment, and allegations that would shock even seasoned investigators. All they knew was that a man had disappeared. And every passing hour made the situation more alarming. Search teams combed through forests. Investigators followed leads. Family members held on to hope. Yet beneath that hope was a growing sense of dread. The feeling that whatever had happened to Patrick Shelton, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. And it wasn't something he could simply walk away from. Because deep in the backroads of Idaho, among the isolated properties, winding dirt roads, and endless stretches of wilderness, people don't just disappear. They vanish for a reason. And in this case, the truth waiting at the end of that road would prove more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. To understand this case, you first have to understand where it happened. Central Idaho is a place unlike much of America. It is a land of towering mountains, winding rivers, and endless stretches of wilderness. In many areas, cell phone service is unreliable. Houses can be separated by miles rather than yards. Some roads disappear into forests and valleys where a person can travel for hours without seeing another vehicle. Life moves differently here. Slower. Quieter. More connected to the land than to the outside world. For many residents, that isolation is exactly what makes the region special. It offers freedom. Privacy. A chance to live without the noise and pressure of crowded cities. But isolation has another side. When problems arise, there are fewer witnesses. When disputes happen, there are fewer people around to intervene. And when something goes wrong in a place like this, it can remain hidden for a very long time. The area surrounding Challis, Idaho, embodies that reality. Nestled among rugged mountains and vast stretches of open land, Challis is the kind of community where people tend to know one another. Neighbors wave as they pass. Local businesses become gathering places. And reputations often travel faster than official news. It's a place where trust matters. Where people depend on one another. And where a single incident can send shockwaves through an entire community. It was here that Patrick Shelton lived. At 47 years old, Patrick was known by those closest to him as a hard-working man who understood the realities of rural life. Friends and family described him as dependable. The kind of person who showed up when he said he would. The kind of person who didn't shy away from difficult work. Living in Idaho's rugged terrain requires a certain level of self-reliance, and Patrick had plenty of it. He was comfortable outdoors. Comfortable navigating remote roads. Comfortable spending long hours in the wilderness. Gathering firewood wasn't unusual for him. Neither was traveling through isolated areas where many people would feel uncomfortable being alone. To Patrick, those places weren't intimidating. They were familiar. Part of everyday life. He understood the risks that came with living in the mountains. Harsh weather. Rough terrain. Mechanical breakdowns miles from help. Those were challenges he knew how to handle. But according to those who knew him, there was no reason to believe he was facing danger from another person. Northwest one close to him imagined that an ordinary day could become the beginning of a homicide investigation. No one imagined that the last time they saw Patrick would truly be the last time. On the other side of this story was Alan Bruce. 70 years old. A man whose life had also been shaped by the realities of rural Idaho. Bruce was known locally as a handyman. Someone who worked with tools. Someone who fixed things. Someone accustomed to solving problems with his hands. Like many people living in remote areas, he occupied a world that revolved around property, equipment, maintenance, and self-sufficiency. He lived on rural land near Challis. A place surrounded by the same wilderness that defined the lives of so many residents in the area. To many who knew of him, there was nothing particularly remarkable about Alan Bruce. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't someone who frequently appeared in headlines. He wasn't known for seeking attention. By most accounts, he was private. Reserved. The kind of person who largely kept to himself. And for years, that may have been how most people viewed him. Just another resident living quietly among Idaho's mountains and forests. But as investigators would later discover, appearances can be deceiving. Because hidden beneath the surface of this quiet rural landscape were circumstances that would eventually draw national attention. Circumstances that would connect these two men in a way neither family could have anticipated. As detectives began reconstructing the events leading up to Patrick Shelton's disappearance, they found themselves tracing a path that repeatedly led back to one location. One property. One timeline. And one encounter. An encounter that prosecutors would later argue changed everything. What began as two separate lives unfolding in the same rural community would eventually converge at a single point in time. A point from which there would be no turning back. A meeting between two men. One who would never return home. And another who would soon find himself at the center of a murder investigation. At this stage, however, none of that was yet known. Patrick Shelton was still simply missing. His family was still searching for answers. And investigators were only beginning to uncover the events that would reveal what happened on that quiet stretch of Idaho wilderness. The clock was ticking. The search was growing more urgent. And somewhere within the vast landscape of central Idaho, the truth was waiting to be discovered. Most tragedies don't announce themselves. They don't begin with flashing lights. Or frantic emergency calls. Or warnings that something terrible is about to happen. Instead, they often start with something ordinary. A routine. An errand. A task so familiar that nobody gives it a second thought. For Patrick Shelton, that day appeared to be exactly that. Just another day in rural Idaho. Just another trip into the wilderness. Just another item on a list of things that needed to get done. According to those close to him, Patrick planned to spend part of the day gathering firewood. It was a normal part of life in the area. People who live in remote communities often depend on firewood for heat, especially during colder months. Collecting it wasn't unusual. It wasn't risky by local standards. In fact, it was something many residents had done countless times before. Patrick was familiar with the land. He knew the roads. He understood the terrain. There was no reason to think this trip would be any different from the dozens that came before it. No urgency. No signs of trouble. No indication that anything was wrong. If someone had seen Patrick that morning, they likely would have viewed it as a completely ordinary day. A man leaving home. A truck heading down a rural road. Nothing more. Nothing less. But sometimes the most ordinary moments become the last moments anyone can fully explain. As the hours passed, life continued normally. Family members went about their day. Friends carried on with their routines. And somewhere out in the vast Idaho wilderness, Patrick was expected to be doing exactly what he had planned. Gathering firewood. Then coming home. That was the expectation. That was the plan. But as afternoon slowly turned into evening, something began to feel different. Patrick had not returned. At first, nobody panicked. There were plenty of reasonable explanations. Maybe he had stayed out longer than expected. Maybe he found a better location farther from town. Maybe he lost track of time. In rural Idaho, delays happen. Road conditions can slow travel. Equipment can break down. Cell phone coverage can disappear without warning. People often find themselves temporarily out of contact. So initially, his absence didn't seem alarming. It was unusual. But not yet frightening. As daylight faded and the shadows grew longer, family members continued to wait. Surely he'd be home soon. Surely there was a simple explanation. Surely everything was fine. But then another hour passed. And another. The sun slipped below the mountains. Darkness settled across the landscape. And Patrick Shelton was still nowhere to be found. That was when concern began to replace patience. Phone calls were made. No answer. More calls followed. Still nothing. Voicemails were left. Messages were sent. Family members hoped his phone battery had died. They hoped he was dealing with a mechanical issue. They hoped there was some innocent explanation waiting just around the corner. But with every unanswered call, the silence grew heavier. Because Patrick's behavior wasn't matching what those closest to him knew about him. This wasn't normal. This wasn't expected. Something had changed. By the time night fully settled over the region, worry had become fear. The mountains that seemed beautiful during daylight now felt vast and unforgiving. Every mile of wilderness suddenly became a possible obstacle. Every remote road became a potential dead end. Family members began retracing his possible routes. Where would he have gone? Which roads would he have taken? Which areas did he usually visit when gathering firewood? The search started informally. A phone call here. A drive down a familiar road there. People checked locations they thought Patrick might have visited. But there was no sign of him. No vehicle. No movement. No explanation. As the hours continued to pass, the reality became harder to ignore. Patrick Shelton was missing. Neighbors were contacted. Friends were called. People who knew the area joined the effort. Everyone hoped that the next phone call would bring good news. Everyone hoped someone would say they had seen him. But no one did. And as concern intensified, local authorities were notified. What had begun as a family's growing worry was now becoming an official investigation. Law enforcement started gathering information. Questions were asked. Timelines were established. Investigators worked to determine where Patrick had last been seen and where he might have traveled. At that moment, nobody knew where the case would lead. Nobody knew what investigators would eventually uncover. Nobody knew that this search would soon become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations the region had seen in years. All they knew was that a man had vanished. A dependable man. A man familiar with the wilderness. A man who should have been home hours ago. And somewhere out in the darkness of rural Idaho, the answers remained hidden. What began as an ordinary day had transformed into something entirely different. A missing person case. A growing mystery. And the first chapter of a story that would soon take a shocking and tragic turn. As the search entered its next phase, concern was growing with every passing hour. Patrick Shelton was still missing. No phone calls. No sightings. No indication that he had made contact with anyone. For family members, the uncertainty was becoming unbearable. Every minute that passed without answers made the situation feel more serious. By now, the effort to find Patrick had expanded well beyond a few worried relatives making phone calls. Volunteers joined the search. Neighbors began checking remote roads and familiar gathering spots. Law enforcement officers coordinated efforts across the area, attempting to identify every possible location Patrick may have visited. The challenge was enormous. This wasn't a city. This wasn't a suburban neighborhood with security cameras on every corner. This was central Idaho. A landscape measured not in blocks, but in miles. Miles of forests. Miles of mountains. Miles of dirt roads winding through terrain where a person could disappear from view almost instantly. Investigators knew time mattered. If Patrick was injured somewhere, every hour reduced the chances of finding him alive. If his vehicle had broken down in a remote location, exposure to the elements could become a serious concern. And if something more sinister had happened, the clock was working against them. Search teams pushed deeper into areas where Patrick was known to travel. Roads were checked. Trails were examined. Remote clearings were searched. Then finally, a breakthrough. The kind investigators hope for in every missing person case. Patrick Shelton's truck had been located. At first, that sounded like good news. Finding the vehicle meant finding a starting point. It meant narrowing the search area. It meant answers could finally be close. But when searchers arrived at the scene, something immediately felt wrong. The truck was sitting in a remote area west of Challis. Alone. Silent. Motionless. There were no obvious signs of a crash. No evidence that it had gone off the road. No indication of mechanical failure visible from a distance. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried beneath brush. It wasn't burned or destroyed. It simply sat there. As if someone had parked it and walked away. But if that was the case, where was Patrick? The scene became even more troubling when investigators looked inside. There, they found Patrick's dog. Alive. Uninjured. Still inside the vehicle. Waiting. For searchers, that discovery immediately stood out. Dogs are creatures of routine. Loyal companions. If Patrick had voluntarily left the area for any significant amount of time, many people would expect him to take his dog with him. If he had suffered a medical emergency nearby, there would likely be some indication of where he had gone. If he had simply wandered away, the dog might have followed. Yet none of those scenarios appeared to fit what investigators were seeing. The dog remained inside the truck. As though its owner had intended to return. As though whatever happened next had occurred unexpectedly. That detail transformed the entire investigation. Because suddenly, the vehicle wasn't just an abandoned truck. It was a puzzle. One that didn't make sense. Investigators began examining every detail. Where exactly had the truck been found? How long had it been sitting there? Had anyone seen it arrive? Had anyone seen Patrick after he parked? The answers were frustratingly scarce. The location itself raised questions. Why would Patrick leave his truck there? What reason would he have for abandoning a perfectly functional vehicle? And perhaps most importantly, why would he leave behind his dog? The deeper investigators looked, the harder it became to find an innocent explanation. Because the truck didn't tell a story of someone choosing to disappear. It told a story of interruption. Something had stopped Patrick's normal routine. Something had prevented him from returning to that driver's seat. And whatever it was, it had happened suddenly. As investigators processed the scene, the atmosphere surrounding the case changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single announcement. No moment where someone officially declared that a crime had occurred. Instead, it was a subtle shift. A feeling. A growing realization shared by those closest to the investigation. This no longer felt like a man who had simply gotten lost in the woods. This no longer felt like a routine search and rescue operation. The evidence was beginning to point somewhere else. Somewhere darker. The discovery of Patrick's truck created answers. But it also created new questions. Questions that would eventually lead investigators toward a rural property. Questions that would connect Patrick Shelton's disappearance to another man. Questions that would uncover a timeline far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. At that moment, however, none of those answers existed yet. There was only the truck. The waiting dog. And an unsettling silence hanging over the Idaho wilderness. A silence that seemed to suggest one thing. Patrick Shelton had not simply vanished. Something had happened. And whatever it was, the truth was still waiting to be found. What began as a missing person investigation had reached a turning point. Quietly at first. Almost imperceptibly. But permanently. Because from that moment forward, investigators were no longer searching for a lost man. They were beginning to search for evidence. And that distinction would change everything. The discovery of Patrick Shelton's truck changed everything. Until that moment, investigators had been operating under several possibilities. A medical emergency. An accident in the wilderness. A mechanical breakdown. Even the possibility that Patrick had somehow become lost in the vast terrain surrounding Chalice. But now they had something tangible. A location. A vehicle. And a scene that raised more questions than it answered. The area surrounding the truck was secured. Investigators began treating it not simply as a recovery site, but as a potential crime scene. Yellow tape appeared. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Every detail mattered. Because in cases like this, the smallest clue can become the key to understanding what happened. As officers worked the scene, forensic teams began a meticulous examination of the vehicle. The truck represented the last known place directly connected to Patrick Shelton. If answers existed, investigators believed there was a good chance some of them would be found there. Every surface was examined. Every compartment was searched. Every item inside was documented. And before long, investigators discovered something that immediately heightened concern. According to court records and later reporting, evidence of blood was reportedly found inside the vehicle. The discovery did not immediately explain what had happened. Blood evidence alone cannot tell the entire story. People suffer cuts. Accidents happen. Injuries occur for many reasons. But context matters. And in this context, investigators were dealing with a missing man, an abandoned truck, and a scene that already felt increasingly suspicious. The reported presence of blood transformed the investigation. It suggested that whatever had happened to Patrick Shelton may have involved more than a simple accident. It suggested that investigators needed to look deeper. Much deeper. While forensic teams continued processing physical evidence, detectives began another critical task. Reconstructing Patrick Shelton's final known movements. Modern investigations often rely on more than eyewitnesses. They rely on data. Phone records. Location information. Digital timelines. Small electronic footprints that people leave behind during their daily lives. Investigators reviewed available records in an effort to determine where Patrick had traveled before his disappearance. They wanted to know where he had gone. Who he may have encountered. And what his final hours looked like. One piece at a time, they began building a timeline. It was a painstaking process. Hours of analysis. Cross-checking locations. Comparing records. Following leads. Most of those leads went nowhere. But one stood out. And the more investigators examined it, the more difficult it became to ignore. The information they reviewed suggested that Patrick's movements had brought him into the vicinity of a rural property associated with Alan Bruce. At first glance, that detail may not seem extraordinary. After all, rural communities often have overlapping routes and neighboring properties. People cross paths. They share roads. They occupy the same general areas. Simply being near a property does not prove a crime occurred there. And investigators knew that. They understood the importance of avoiding assumptions. They understood that proximity alone is not evidence of guilt. But proximity can be important. Especially when investigators are trying to determine where to focus limited resources. Because every investigation eventually reaches a point where detectives must make decisions. Which leads deserve attention? Which locations should be examined? Which individuals should be interviewed? As the evidence accumulated, the answers to those questions increasingly pointed in one direction. Toward Alan Bruce's property. At this stage, investigators were not announcing conclusions. They were gathering facts. Following evidence. Looking for anything that could either confirm or eliminate possibilities. But the property was now on their radar. And that alone marked a significant development. Because until then, the focus had been on finding Patrick Shelton. Now investigators were beginning to focus on where he may have spent his final known hours. The distinction was subtle. But important. The investigation was evolving. Slowly shifting away from a search operation and towards something more complex. Something more serious. The more detectives examined the timeline, the more they realized that understanding what happened near that property could be critical to solving the case. Questions began to multiply. Had Patrick visited the property voluntarily? Had he encountered someone there? Had an argument occurred? Had something unexpected taken place? At that moment, no one knew. The answers remained hidden. But investigators were moving closer. Every piece of evidence seemed to point toward the same location. A quiet piece of rural Idaho land. A property that, until then, had attracted little attention. A property that would soon become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations the region had seen in years. And as detectives prepared to take a closer look, they had no way of knowing just how significant that decision would become. Because what investigators would eventually uncover there would reshape the entire case. The abandoned truck had been the first major breakthrough. But it was only the beginning. The real story was still waiting to be discovered. And according to investigators, that story would lead directly to Alan Bruce's land. When investigators arrived at Bruce's property, they were entering unknown territory. Large rural land. Outbuildings. Burn areas. Tools scattered across workspaces typical of a handyman's setup. At first glance, nothing stood out. But investigators weren't looking for obvious signs. They were looking for disruption. Irregularity. Anything that didn't belong. And they found it. Burned debris in isolated areas. Signs of disturbance in soil. Materials that suggested cleanup activity rather than normal work. Nothing was confirmed yet. But the direction of the case was changing rapidly. Because now, investigators weren't just asking where Patrick Shelton had gone. They were asking a much more dangerous question. What happened to him after he arrived here? As investigators continued examining Alan Bruce's property, the case reached a turning point. At first, there was no single piece of evidence that told the full story. But what they did have was a pattern. A missing man. A vehicle found abandoned. And digital evidence that placed Patrick Shelton in the same general area as Bruce's rural property around the time he disappeared. Individually, each detail could be explained. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. Investigators began developing a theory. Not of accident. Not of disappearance. But of confrontation. According to the direction the investigation was taking, Patrick Shelton may have come into contact with Alan Bruce on or near the property that day. What happened next was still unclear. But whatever it was, it ended in violence. And then, something even more troubling. An attempt to erase what had happened. As pressure built, Alan Bruce became a central focus of the investigation. He was brought in for questioning. At first, the conversation appeared controlled. Bruce reportedly described events in a way that suggested a conflict had occurred between him and Patrick Shelton. He claimed the situation escalated quickly. And then came the key claim that would later define the defense narrative. Self-defense. According to Bruce's account, Patrick Shelton allegedly became aggressive during an encounter on or near his property. Bruce stated that he felt threatened. And in that moment, he used a firearm. A single act, he claimed, that changed everything. But investigators were not only focused on what happened during the confrontation. They were focused on what came after. Because the timeline did not end with a shooting. It continued. And according to investigators, it continued in a way that suggested deliberate concealment. As questioning continued, Bruce allegedly provided additional details about what happened after the fatal encounter. Those details, as reported in court documents, included efforts to move the body, destroy evidence, and conceal what had taken place. It was at this point that the case stopped being a disappearance and became something much more serious. A homicide investigation. What investigators later described as a confession was not a simple admission. It was a breakdown of events given in fragments. According to court-reported accounts, Bruce acknowledged that Patrick Shelton had been shot during the encounter. But what followed shocked even experienced investigators. Because the focus of the case was no longer only the shooting. It was what allegedly happened afterward. The disposal of evidence. The destruction of remains. And efforts to prevent discovery. Investigators alleged that the body was dismembered using tools consistent with those found on the property. Burned materials were reportedly recovered during searches. And remains, according to court filings, were partially recovered from multiple locations, including burned debris areas and nearby terrain. One phrase that circulated widely in reporting tied to the case was a chilling summary of the alleged mindset behind the concealment. Shoot, shovel, and shut up. Whether spoken directly in that exact form or paraphrased in investigation summaries, the phrase became symbolic of the alleged intent behind the actions investigators believed took place. At this point, the case had moved far beyond a simple confrontation. It had become a story of aftermath. And what people do when they believe no one is watching. Once the investigation reached this stage, recovery efforts intensified. Search teams returned to areas connected to the property. Burn zones were examined carefully. Fragments of evidence were collected and analyzed. Every piece mattered. Because the goal was no longer just to understand what happened. It was to account for what remained. For Patrick Shelton's family, the process was devastating. They were now facing a reality that went beyond disappearance. This was no longer about hope. It was about confirmation. And even then, answers came slowly. Not everything could be recovered. Not everything could be explained. And not every question had a clear response. But investigators had built a case strong enough to move forward. And soon, arrests followed. Alan Bruce was formally arrested and charged in connection with Patrick Shelton's death. The charges included homicide-related offenses and additional counts related to the destruction of evidence and actions taken after the incident. As the case moved into the legal system, both sides began shaping their arguments. The prosecution focused on intent, sequence of events, and alleged efforts to conceal the crime. The defense maintained the central claim of self-defense. That Patrick Shelton was the aggressor. And that Bruce's actions were a reaction to a perceived threat. The courtroom became the battleground for two competing narratives. One focused on justification. The other on concealment. And between them was a missing man whose final moments were still being pieced together. Rather than proceed through a full trial, the case eventually shifted toward a plea resolution. Bruce entered what is known as an Alford plea. This meant he did not fully admit guilt, but acknowledged that prosecutors likely had enough evidence to secure a conviction. It allowed the court process to move forward without a full jury trial. During sentencing, emotional statements were delivered by Patrick Shelton's family. They spoke about loss, about unanswered questions, and about the difficulty of finding closure when so much of the story remains incomplete. The court ultimately imposed a prison sentence, closing the legal chapter of the case. But not necessarily the emotional one. Because for the family, the outcome was not just about justice. It was about what could never be returned. In the end, This case is not just about one confrontation, or one property, or one confession. It is about how quickly ordinary moments can collapse into irreversible consequences. A man leaves home to gather firewood. A routine task in a familiar place. And never returns. What follows is an investigation that reveals fragments of truth, but never fully restores what was lost. Because some cases end in verdicts. But not in closure. And for Patrick Shelton's family, the silence left behind still remains. As we continue following the facts of this case, one thing remains certain. A family lost someone they loved. And behind every headline, every court document, and every investigation, there are real people whose lives were changed forever. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe investigators uncovered the full truth about what happened to Patrick Shelton, or do you think there are still unanswered questions? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you found this video informative and want to see more in-depth true crime investigations, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Dark Case Files. Your support helps us continue bringing attention to cases that deserve to be remembered. And if there's a case you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember. Sometimes the most chilling mysteries don't happen in crowded cities. They happen in the quiet places where nobody is supposed to disappear. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.